thought I had a true faith, but going through a few obstacles a few years ago, quite a few, my husband wasn't sure at a time if he wanted to be married, and at the same time we were going through alcohol and drug addictions with our son. So it was very, very painful.
Just life just stopped meaning something for me. I just got into this loop, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And there were times when I would shake it off and then come back, and we had a good period of time, and everything was fine. And all of a sudden, this just got a hold of me again, and it was like a struggle with something else trying to pull me down. I'm very mad at myself for putting my family through what I was putting them through, but I didn't know how to get out of it. I never thought I'd truly distance myself completely from God, but I did everything I could possibly do to do that, because I think I was just angry. I actually put a 12 gauge in my face, and I actually pulled the trigger. Bullet was in my hand. I don't remember taking it out. But she walked up in the room and saw me, and I just looked at her, I gave it to her, and then later when I realized I had the shell in my hand, I went over and gave it to her. And it got scary then. Because if I was able to do that, there's no coming back from that.
I felt like a failure as a mom, as a wife, and to God. So for 7 months, going through the true struggles, I literally sat in the garage by the garbage because I felt like a failure every night through the winter. I had an MP3 player that would freeze up, and I would fall asleep out there, but I didn't care because I really didn't want to be alive. And I had the knife right by my wrists, and I remember praying to God, please don't let me bleed out before I can beg for forgiveness so I don't go to hell. Two different nights, But he was there. I mean, that was the darkest moment of my life. But yet I was listening to contemporary Christian music on my MP3. Mm-hmm. So he was there. I just couldn't feel it. So I called my girlfriend and I said, you want to go to Parker Hill? Because I had heard it was a great place and I couldn't go back to my church. I didn't want to be around people. And she said she would. And that was March 8th of 2008. And the night before was the last night that I sat in that garage. And when I walked in, the 4 songs they were playing were 4 songs that I listened to thousands of times those 7 months in total darkness. And that's when that feeling just overtook me that I knew I was finally where I belonged and it was going to be okay.
Welcome, everybody. It is so good to have you here this morning as we worship together, one church in 3 places. And I just want to say a big thank you to Jill and Juan from our Dixon City campus for sharing the story of their spiritual journey. And such a powerful story. And you'll get to hear the rest of their story at the end of our time together today. But it's just been, I don't know about you, but I feel like it's been so encouraging every week to hear the stories of God drawing people back to himself and changing them from the inside out. And I don't know about you, but for me, that never gets old. Hearing those stories, that never gets old. And I will give my life to making sure, to the best of my ability, that we continue to be a church where we hear stories like that all the time. Well, today is week number 5 in this teaching series called Believe. And during this series, we've been focusing on one book of the Bible, the Gospel of John, making our way through it and looking into the stories of people who met Jesus but then faced some kind of barrier to belief, some obstacle that kept them from fully embracing faith. And today, we're talking about what I think is one of the greatest barriers to belief, and that is fear. We can become paralyzed by the fear of what will happen if we take that step of faith. Paralyzed by the fear of what other people will think or what that will mean for my reputation or how that will impact my career. And fear can stop us in our tracks. Fear can keep us from moving forward in our relationship with God. In fact, as I begin talking about this subject, I just want to quote from one of my favorite theologians, Dr. Seuss. This was something he wrote very early in his career. It was never even published in a book, just a piece that he wrote, a story called The Zode in the Road. Now, let me read it to you. It says this: "Did I ever tell you about the young Zode who came to 2 signs at the fork in the road? One said to place 1 and the other place 2. So the Zode had to make up his mind what to do. Well, the Zode scratched his head and his chin and his pants, and he said to himself, I'll be taking a chance. If I go to place 1, it may be too hot, and so how do I know if I'll like it or not? On the other hand, though, I'll be sort of a fool if I go to place 2 and find it too cool. In that case, I may catch a chill and turn blue, so maybe place 1 is the best, not place 2. But then again, what if place 1 is too high? I may catch a terrible earache and die. So place 2 may be best. On the other hand, though, what might happen to me if place 2 is too low? I might get some very strange pain in my toe. And for 36 hours and a half, that poor Zode made starts and made stops at the fork in the road, saying, don't take a chance. No, you may not be right. And then he got an idea that was wonderfully bright. Play safe, cried the Zode. I'll play safe. I'm no dunce. I'll simply start out for both places at once. And that's how the Zode, who would not take a chance, got to no place at all with a split in his pants. I love Dr. Seuss. But fear, it can do the very same thing to us. It can keep us immobilized and paralyzed. It can keep us from moving forward. And today we're going to look at the story of a man who came to a fork in the road. And his fear kept him from making the right decision. In fact, it kept him from making really any decision at all. His name was Pilate. We're going to be talking today about Pilate. And by the way, his name is not Pilate. For those of you who are really into physical fitness, his name is Pilate. And Pilate was a man who woke up one Friday morning and he was faced with the biggest decision of his life because he had to decide what to do with Jesus. And even though Pilate knew what was right, he didn't have the courage to choose what was right because he was afraid. He was afraid of what he might lose. He was afraid of what other people would think. And so in his fear, instead of making a courageous decision, he really tries to avoid any decision. He just delays and he delays and he delays, and he ends up crucifying an innocent man. And I think there's a warning that comes from the story of Pilate, a warning that every single one of us needs to hear, and it simply goes like this, that my delay will eventually become my decision. My delay will eventually become my decision. And here's what I mean by that. There are just some areas of life where not making any decision actually becomes a decision by default. I'll give you a couple of examples. I've never met the guy who said, I'm hoping to have to work until I'm 80 years old because I didn't save enough for retirement. I've never met the person who made that decision. But I've met lots of people who delay making the decision to save and to plan and to invest and to prepare for retirement. And so they arrive at that point not ready for it, not because they made that decision, but because they delayed making a decision, and their delay, in fact, became a decision. Or I've never met the person who was planning to have a heart attack at the age of 55. Nobody ever decides that. But what happens so often is people delay deciding to eat better and exercise and go to the doctor for a checkup. And so then they perhaps get to age 55 and have a heart attack, not because they decided to, but because they delayed deciding to do something else. And delays can eventually become decisions. Or I'll give you one more example. In a few weeks, Debbie and I will celebrate 22 years of marriage. And I can still remember sitting in that restaurant across from her and opening up a box with a ring in it that cost me a good chunk of my annual salary. And I held it out to her and I said to her, Debbie, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? And she had, at that point, a decision to make, a very important decision. And it was kind of nerve-wracking because at first she didn't even respond. All she did was cry. And I wasn't sure how to take that. But, I've been married for a while now, and I came to understand years ago that for my wife, crying is kind of like the utility infielder of emotions. It covers all the bases. Like it covers happiness and excitement and sadness and all of that. And fortunately, these were tears of joy. And she said yes, but she could have said something very different. She could have said, well, Mark, I just don't know if I'm ready. Just don't know if you're the one. I'm just not sure. So let's just kind of put this on hold and talk about it at a later time. And if she had chosen to delay and continued to delay, then that delay would eventually have become a decision. And I'd still be single today because nobody else would have measured up. Oh, yeah, that's right. There are times when a delay becomes a decision. And for some of you here today, this is the message that you need to hear in this series, because you know there's a decision that you need to make. That God has been prompting you to take a step of belief or to take a step of obedience, and there's something you need to change, something that you need to get rid of in your life, some next step that you need to take, but you've been delaying and delaying and delaying. And if you delay long enough, eventually that delay will become a decision in itself, because eventually here's what will happen. The conviction will be gone, the momentum will slow down, God's voice will grow quiet, and your delay will become a decision. And this is how the story of Pilate plays out. So let's talk about Pilate. If you really want to understand Pilate, you have to understand a little bit of the history at that time in that part of the world. At this point in time, the nation of Israel was not an independent nation. They were part of the vast Roman Empire under the authority of the Romans. Pilate was the governor of this little slice of the Roman Empire called Israel. He had been appointed by the Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, and really Rome only expected two things from Pilate: collect the taxes and keep the peace. Just collect the taxes and keep the peace. Keep the money flowing to Rome, keep the people under control, and everything will be fine. Pilate, as long as you collect the taxes and keep the peace, you're going to be large and in charge. In fact, there was a discovery made in the 1960s. Archaeologists discovered something that gives us a glimpse into the heart of Pilate. And by the way, this is the very first evidence they ever found outside of the Bible that Pilate even existed. Some people doubted it, but they found this stone. It's called the Pilate stone, and it has an inscription on it. And it says, Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, has dedicated to the people of Caesarea a temple in honor of Tiberius Caesar. I mean, think about it. What a great way to impress your boss, right? You build a temple, you dedicate it to him. This tells you something about Pilate. Pilate was a man who loved his position. He loved his power, and he would do anything to keep it. And it was ultimately his fear of losing his position that would cause him to avoid making the choice that he should have made. So we're going to pick up in John chapter 18 today. Gospel of John chapter 18. At this point, Jesus now has been arrested. He was already brought to the high priest named Caiaphas. He was subjected to a hasty trial in the middle of the night, and the Jewish leaders decided he was guilty of the sin of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God. He was, but they didn't believe he was, so they accused him of the sin of blasphemy. And they want Pilate then to put him to death. Let me pick up in verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we wouldn't have handed him over to you." The big word for that is obfuscation. They didn't really give him an answer. They just said, obviously, he's a really bad guy, or we wouldn't have brought him here. And Pilate doesn't accept that. Verse 31, Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. And this is true. According to Roman law, the Jewish people did not have the power to carry out capital punishment. Only Rome had that authority, and specifically Pilate. So what they said was true. But what you have to understand is that there was something deeper going on here. See, what they could have done is they could have just taken Jesus outside the city to somewhere obscure, and they could have put him to death by stoning him. In fact, not long after this, that's exactly what they do with one of the first disciples named Stephen. So they could have just killed him by stoning him, and Pilate probably would have just looked the other way. The problem was this: the Jewish leaders knew that Jesus had become very popular with the common people. Too popular for them to get away with that. So they wanted to get rid of Jesus, but they didn't want anyone to blame them for it. So they're trying to shovel this off onto Pilate. And so Pilate now is in this very difficult position. He doesn't want to do something that's going to create a riot among the common people. It's his job to keep them under control. And he doesn't want to tick off the religious leaders either, because he needs their support. So he has to make a very difficult decision. He comes to a fork in the road. And listen to what he does. We're going to pick up now in John 18:33. If you have a note sheet, go ahead and take that out of your bulletin. It should be there, and you can follow along there as I begin. Verse 33, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" See, Pilate's asking this question because he has to find out if Jesus really is a threat to the Roman Empire. Is he planning to lead some kind of rebellion against them? And so he says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And by the way, this was not an easy question to answer. Because if Jesus had simply said, "Yes, I'm the king of the Jews," then Pilate could have accused him of being an insurrectionist, ready to lead a rebellion against Rome. So he can't just say yes. On the other hand, if he says no, he denies his true position as the Messiah, the real spiritual king of Israel. So there's no simple answer. Here's what he says, verse 36. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." He says, "Yes, Pilate, I'm a king. But I'm not a king that has any concern with worldly power. Rome needs fear no threat from me." Verse 37, "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. But in fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." He says, "I'm the king of those who seek truth. I've come into this world to bring the truth." And listen to the way that Pilate responds. "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. If I were to translate that into today's language and culture, he basically says this. He says, "Whatever." And then he walks away. It's amazing to me because standing within a few feet of Pilate was the embodiment of truth, the hope of the world, the very Son of God. And yet Pilate just kind of brushes this all off and he says, "Whatever." He just wants to get through his day. See, Pilate isn't concerned with wrestling with truth. Pilate's only concerned with doing whatever he has to do to protect his career. And to be honest, Pilate reminds me of so many people today. In fact, I came across a word this past week that I think describes the attitude that so many people today have about God and have about truth and about spiritual things. It's the word apatheist. Apatheist. It's a title that's becoming more and more popular among people, especially college students. See, an atheist is someone who believes there is a God. A theist is someone who believes there is a God. An atheist is someone who believes there is no God. An agnostic is somebody who says, "Well, I don't know if there is a God." But an apatheist is somebody who says, "I don't know if there is a God, and I'm not sure it really even matters." Like, I don't know, and I don't care. And let me just say that it is the height of eternal insanity to dismiss the most important question in the world. What is truth? Is there a God? How has he related to us? And even if you're an apatheist, eventually something is going to rattle you. Something is going to shake your complacency and bring you to a moment of decision. It will. It might be just coming to the end of yourself and facing all kinds of discouragement like Juan and Jill in the video that we saw earlier. It might be sitting in a funeral home at the funeral of somebody that you loved who passed away way too young. And it's surreal, and you're just confronted with the mortality and the brevity of life and your own mortality. That might be the moment when you're shaken out of that apathy and God has your attention. It might be your own brush with death, that close call. I don't know what it is, but every single one of us, we come to these points in life where we're shaken out of our complacency, and that is decision time. That is the fork in the road when we have to decide. Pilate is about to come to that point. Verse 38, with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there. He's just questioned Jesus. And he says, "I find no basis for a charge against him." It's very interesting when you read the story of Pilate here. That phrase is repeated 3 times. 3 different times Pilate goes out to the crowd of people and the religious leaders, and he says 3 times, "I find no basis for a charge against him. I find no basis for a charge against him. I find no basis for a charge against him." And yet, Pilate refuses to set him free. He just keeps delaying and delaying and delaying, and eventually his delay becomes a decision by default. Back to verse 38. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? Now, let me explain this. There was a tradition that every year at the time of Passover, Pilate, kind of as a goodwill gesture, would bring out all the Jewish prisoners and he would allow the people to choose one of them to be set free. That was just kind of his gift to them at Passover because he was such a nice guy. But he changes the rules a little bit this year. Instead of allowing them to free any prisoner, he gives them a choice between just two people, Jesus or Barabbas. In fact, there are a few more details in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27. It says at that time they had a notorious prisoner, meaning everybody hated Barabbas. He was a bad guy. And so when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus? The one who healed your sick, the one who feeds you, the one who has taught you, Jesus, who is called Christ. So Pilate figures, if I put Jesus and Barabbas out there, this is a slam dunk. There is no way they're going to choose Barabbas over Jesus. They're going to let Jesus go free. It is a perfect compromise because he could declare Jesus guilty for the record, but then he could set him free at the same time. I mean, it was brilliant, except for one thing. It didn't work. And it tells us in verse 20 why it didn't work. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus executed. So he delays and he tries a compromise and it just kind of backfires on him. And then look what happens next. Go back to John 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Why did he do that? I mean, what crime did Jesus commit? Well, he hadn't committed any crime. Pilate said, I find no basis for a charge against him. Jesus wasn't being punished for any crime. He was being punished because Pilate was trying to pacify the crowd and keep the peace and keep his job. He was hoping that he could just beat Jesus severely enough that they would all look at him and say, okay, that's enough. He's been punished enough. And as you may know, flogging was a terrible punishment. If you saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ, you know that scene in the movie was the most difficult scene to watch. But it was accurate. Flogging would literally tear the flesh away from a man's body and leave him bleeding and completely broken. So Pilate flogs him, and then he brings him back out to the crowd. Verse 4, once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. Well, if there's no basis for a charge against him, why did you just have him beaten? When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here's the man. Look at him. He's no king. He's no threat. He's broken. He's humiliated. So Pilate's hoping they'll just give up and be satisfied and go away and leave him alone. But again, he tries to delay. He tries to compromise. Didn't work. Verse 6. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. And the Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Boom. And they finally come clean about the real reason that they brought Jesus there. And when Pilate hears this, he's rattled. He's shaken out of his complacency. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Now you'll notice it says he was even more afraid, which implies that he was already afraid even before this. And here's why, I think. He had heard about Jesus. He knew the word on the street. This was a man who was working miracles. I think Pilate was already convinced that the man standing in front of him was no ordinary man. And then he hears this. And on top of that, it says in the Gospel of Matthew that right around this time, a message came to him. It was a message that someone brought to him from his wife. Matthew 27:19, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I've suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. Pilate is afraid. He is shaken. He's come to a moment of decision. So what is he going to do? Is he going to make the right choice? Is he going to let him go free? Verse 9, he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. He wasn't looking for an address. He wanted to know, are you sent from God? Are you from heaven? Are you really the Son of God? But it says Jesus gave him no answer. He wasn't interested in the truth. And that silence made Pilate even more angry. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you, and I don't have the guts to do either one, it should say. And I love the way Jesus responds, verse 11. Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Pilate, you're not in control of my destiny. Pilate, there is someone more powerful than you or Tiberius or any other human ruler. And Pilate, one day you will stand before that God and you will give an answer for every decision you have made. And again, Pilate is brought face to face with the sobering truth of God's existence and his accountability to God. And it says from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. Which is a striking statement. What does it mean he tried to set him free? He just got done saying he had the power to set him free. I think Pilate needed Yoda to come along and say, try not, do, or do not. There is no try. That's for all the Star Wars fans out there. He tried to set him free. What does that mean, he tried to set him free? He had a choice to make. He refused to make it. He just kept delaying. But here's the problem. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. That was a thinly veiled threat. Here's what they're saying to him. They're saying, listen, Pilate, you better cooperate with us. Because if you don't cooperate with us, guess what? Caesar is going to hear about this, and he will be none too happy when he finds out you let a man go who was claiming to be a king instead of Caesar. You see his problem? Pilate is caught between two kings. The king who is still inside his palace, bleeding and broken, and the king who is the most powerful man in the world at that time, Tiberius. And Pilate is paralyzed by his fear. He's afraid of what he might lose. He's afraid of what other people are going to think. And so he gives into his fear. And verse 16, listen to the first word of verse 16. Finally, after his resolve faded, after the conviction was gone, finally, after he gave in to all the voices of the crowd, finally, his delay became a decision, and Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. See, Pilate had to choose which king he was going to follow, Jesus or Caesar. And his delay became a decision, and he eventually chose to follow Tiberius Caesar, not Jesus Christ. But here's the interesting thing. 2,000 years later, the Roman Empire is gone. It's just a few pages in the history books. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ lives and thrives and grows today in the hearts of millions of men and women all over the world. So here's the question. Which king are you going to follow? Because we all face the same choice that Pilate faced. We all have to give our verdict about Jesus Christ. We all either have to choose to believe that he really was who he claimed to be, or we have to disbelieve him and just walk away. See, Pilate didn't have the courage to decide for or against Jesus. Pilate didn't have the courage to condemn him or defend him. And the truth is, some of you hearing this message right now are just like Pilate. You've really never made a clear decision about whether you really believe in Jesus. You're not against him. I mean, you come to church, you might even think of yourself as a Christian, but you're not a full-on follower of Jesus, because there are more pressing matters in your life to think about, like your career and your friends and your money and your family. And so you just delay and you delay and you delay. You're not against him, but you're not really committed to him either. You're just kind of an apatheist. Well, let me suggest that maybe today is the day. Today is the day to make a clear decision, because delay will become a decision eventually. And you need to decide that you are going to believe that Jesus is who he said he was, and that he's your only hope for now and for eternity. And then you need to decide after that that you're going to go public with your faith. And in about 8 weeks, In September, we're going to do a weekend baptism again, and that will be your chance to really decide openly and freely. If you've never taken that step of baptism, just pay attention during the summer. We'll tell you more about it. We want you to be part of that. Others of you here today, you're a believer. I mean, you've taken that step of faith. But here's the deal for you. There's some next step that you need to take because you've reached kind of a spiritual plateau. And there's something that God is calling you to do, or something He's calling you to stop doing, or something He's calling you to change. There's some next step that you need to take, but you're delaying that decision. And let me tell you what's going to happen. Eventually, the conviction will be gone, the momentum will fade, God's voice will grow quiet, and you will die, and that delay will become de facto a decision. That was Pilate. You know, when I think of the story of Pilate, I think of this game that we used to play at summer camp when I was a kid. We had this game that we would play at summer camp. It was called Blind Ambulance. And there were a number of teams, and every team had 5 people on it. And 4 of the guys on the team would carry just a very simple stretcher on their shoulders. And the 5th guy on the team would be up on top of that stretcher, kind of a cot that they would carry. The 4 guys carrying it would all be blindfolded. And the guy on top wasn't blindfolded. He was the only one who could see where to go. And so there were all these teams, and the object of the game was to race through a set of obstacles to the finish line and to be the first team to get there. But the only way to get through the obstacles and get to the finish line was to listen to the voice of the one who could see. But what made this game, Blind Ambulance, so challenging is that there were people on the sidelines all screaming and cheering for other teams, or sometimes trying to misdirect you. And it was really hard to hear the guy who spoke with the voice of truth. That was Pilate. I mean, it was a fun game, Blind Ambulance. It was every insurance company's nightmare, but it was a fun game. And that was Pilate. Pilate was surrounded by these voices who were shouting at him about what to do. And Pilate, unfortunately, in the clamor of those voices, failed to listen to the one voice that really mattered, the voice of truth who was standing right there in front of him. And instead of making a courageous decision, he just simply delayed, and that delay became a decision. And the same is true for us. Every day we are surrounded by the clamoring voices of our culture, shouting for us to ignore Christ, to abandon the truth, and to give our allegiance to the little kingdoms of this world. But beneath all that noise, behind all those voices, there is that one still, small voice of your Heavenly Father, calling you to take a step of belief, or calling you to take a step of obedience. And today, for many of us today, needs to be a time of commitment. It needs to be a time of decision. A decision of belief or a decision of obedience. Today is the day to put aside your fear of what you may lose, your fear of what other people are going to think, to set aside your worship of other kingdoms and other kings, and to stop delaying, and to decide you're going to go all in, you're going to follow Jesus with everything that you have. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to listen to the part 2 of Jill and Juan's story. It's an incredible story. And the band is going to come back up, and we're going to sing one last song together. It's a song of belief and a song of commitment, a song of decision. And it will be a time today for us to make decisions on every campus, in every room. But first, let me just close this series, let me close this message by reading the very words of Jesus himself. In the last book of the Bible, he gives this invitation. He says this, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in." Watch this with me.
We actually were in Puerto Rico on our 25th anniversary, and I pretty much was going to say goodbye to everybody. I prayed all night, and the next day I called my oldest daughter, and I said, you know, Angel, I don't want a divorce. I love your father to death, but I don't know what to do. It's been 4 years of fighting, and my faith has gotten stronger, but if I could just give him a tiny bit of what I have found at Parker Hill, and through my relationship with God, the most amazing things have happened. And she said, Mom, just go to the beach and try one more time. Just go talk. And I said, I've said everything. I don't know what to say. I prayed as fervently as I could. I said, God, he is so lost. We are so lost. I'm knocking on the door for him, because even if we're not going to make it, he's my best friend and I want him to find you. But we went to the beach and we talked and cried for 3 hours. So God was listening, because that was the first time in 4 years he said, you know what, I do want to try. So I said, I don't know if it's going to work, but alls I want is I want you to go to Parker Hill with me once a month. You're not a churchgoer, so I wasn't going to say 4, not knowing. I said, just come with me once a
Baby
month.
steps.
Well, we came and he never stopped.
God was constantly trying to reach me and trying to talk to me. I was just not listening. I thought it was going to be almost impossible to come back from that, and it wasn't. It wasn't. It just took was that leap of faith and that belief that there's nothing you can do that God's going to completely turn away from you. It's not going to happen. But you also have to take the step to reach out towards it. I started trying really hard to just come back from where I was, going to church, coming to Parker Hill, and starting to read the scripture. And the moment I opened up and I started allowing myself to believe and opening myself to God and everything else, now all of a sudden I can hear, I can see, and the change in our life is just
Phenomenal.
yes.